This is the Authority Company Podcast, conversations with leaders who are designing the future. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila. My guest today, Chris Festog. I spent more than 4 decades in finance, including senior leadership roles with the likes of Texaco, Zurich Insurance Group, and Mutual of America Financial Group. In his new book, The CFO Advantage, Chris explains how finance leaders can move beyond the numbers and become strategic partners, leaders, and drivers of change. Chris, welcome to the show. How are you, my friend?
I'm very well. Thank you, Joe.
You're very welcome. And so let me ask a silly question, and I've been known to ask silly questions on these podcasts, where you'll see companies have a CFO, and for like the larger companies, you're like, okay, I get the idea that in the C-suite you have someone like that. But in other companies, it's like the staff accountant or the accountant. For the uninitiated, for folks not in that sphere, like what differentiates what a CFO is as opposed to an accountant? Because early in the book, you have this line where you say that many CFOs define themselves as technical experts / the accounting side. What keeps the finance leaders stuck in that world of just being the accountant and being more than that? So let's start the conversation with that, Chris.
Yeah. Hey, so first of all, most CFOs are accountants, right? So there is a very technical aspect to being a CFO in virtually every organization. If you get in really large organizations, you might be a finance guy, you might be an MBA guy, because you're dealing with much, much bigger picture kind of topics. If we're going to buy a business, sell a business, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
For most organizations, the CFO simply is the highest level financial person. So that person needs to have a technical competency to be able to do financials, build financial plans, analyze taxes and tax implications to transactions and things like that. But with that person, and in most organizations, what differentiates CFO from like a normal accountant is that you have to bring that business component to the conversation, right? So it's never just what's the proper accounting for something or what's the tax impact of something, but why is the implication of that? Why did that take place? How do we plan around that, or how do we optimize that in order to be successful? So just like you might have a product designer that designs bicycles, he better be a good engineer to design the bicycle so the bicycle is great. A finance guy brings financial expertise that helps the business go in the right way.
And I know you might be slightly biased, but you argue that the CFO role is probably outside of the CEO, the most influential leader in the organization because of all the things you've been talking about. Why do, maybe an idiot like I, with that opening question, why do so many people, underestimate the CFO's influence?
I think a lot of CFOs, and this is part of why I wrote the book, right, is a lot of CFOs see themselves as primarily technicians. And so therefore that's how other people will perceive them. I mean, the proverbial phrase bean counter is thrown out to financial environments. And a lot of times what happens is the financial team, the financial leadership, they never get out of that technical bubble. So they don't add that additional value. They don't build into the organization. They don't challenge the organization. They don't say, hey, why don't we start a new business line? In fact, many people see the financial people as basically the guys that say no, no,
Right.
we don't have enough money, and not yes, why don't we go do something? So at the end of the day, it's kind of self-fulfilling for a lot of folks, and it's how I've challenged a lot of my team over the years is it's like, guys, I don't care how technical you are. If you don't understand the business, you can't even do your technical accounting correct. So that's it. It changes the nature, the power of the role when you really understand the business and the technical aspects. The CFO sees. I mean, how I always like to talk about accounting is accounting is simply taking every economic transaction in a business and capturing it, right, and defining it in a way and communicating in a particular way. So as an accountant, as a CFO, we see everything that happens in an organization. And so it's just, we see it in economic terms, but then we have to translate, if you do it well, you have to translate what are the business implications of that? Why did we spend that money? Why did we make that money? Why are we losing that money? Why are we growing in this area? And what are the implications?
That's great. And it's funny because you mentioned that I was going to ask you about the no before yes mentality of many CFOs. Is that what you think stops them from growing into further leadership roles because they have that vibe. And I've spoken to CEOs where they'll say like, my CFO slash accountant drives me crazy because every time I have an idea, they say no. That having that chief killjoy officer on board. Do you think you see that? And this could be anecdotal on your side. Does that prevent them from potentially making that shift to the CEO seat because they have this sort of vibe about them? Or again, or I could just be projecting this on you, but that's the way I envision how some of that C-suite shuffle happens.
No, more professions, more accountants are CEOs than just about any other profession. So the way to the CEO suite oftentimes is through the CFO suite and understanding the business again. But like, I'm working in a nonprofit now, and my CEO, I just started working with him, and probably 3-4 months into our time, he said, for a finance guy, you sure don't talk about business much or about accounting much. And it's like, no, I talk about business. Like if I have to tell my CEO about the finance stuff, that's my job. What he wants to understand is how can we actually build and develop a better business. So yeah, I think that, come on, certain types of people become accountants, right? They might be technical, they might be math oriented, which is the typical scenario. But so people go into a field and they have particular skills that maybe help them get to a certain level in that
Right.
career. But what helps you go to that whole nother level is when you come in with a strategic mindset, with a business mindset, when you go into a room and say, okay, what do people need here? And how can I help them get it? I think every place I've ever worked, I've spent more money than when I got there. Right. So I've never spent less. In fact, I never wanted to take jobs where you spent less money because that's not who I am. I'd be a terrible guy. Okay, let's slash everything by 20%. I'd fail at that miserably because that's not what I want to do. Now, I might save money here to spend it over there, but at the end of the day, how businesses grow is and how they succeed is they build new products, they build new markets, they innovate in new ways, and a CFO should really help through that process to understand how to optimize the use of resources and to really understand what's happening within the organization so you can make wise decisions.
And in the aforementioned book, you mentioned and introduced the idea of the high impact CFO, and they operate through stewardship, leadership, and transformation.
Correct.
Break down quick, nothing too deep divey here, Chris, but break down those three pillars: stewardship, leadership, and transformation in evolving what becomes a high impact CFO.
Yeah, so steward, I am first and foremost a steward, right? So what am I a steward of? I'm a steward of the company, the shareholders. I'm a steward of the employees who work there. I'm a steward of the customers. So I'm a steward of the broader bureaucratic or regulatory environment. So as a steward, all that means is this isn't my job. This isn't my company. I'm a steward of it for a period of time, and I'm going to do what's right. I'm going to do what is best for all those various different stakeholders. And so the beauty and the wonder of stewardship in a business role is the fact that you have to balance all these various different stakeholders and be fair to all of them. And I think in as a financial guy, as a CFO, that stewardship of money becomes a fundamental aspect of that. So are we spending the money the right way? Are we be spending it fairly to each of different participants that we're interacting with? So that's stewardship, right? But
But I want
stewardship,
to say one of my favorite lines of the book is about stewardship. You said it doesn't own anything, but is responsible for everything. Which is kind of funny because you don't really think about that. You just like we've talked about, like you're the numbers guy, but when you've really got to take everything into account than just the numbers.
yes. I mean, frequently in meetings or conversations, if we're talking about doing something, I look at somebody and say, if this was your money, would you spend it? And that changes the conversation because people spend other people's money differently than they spend
Yes.
their own, right? And that isn't always a good thing. Sometimes you spend it too conservatively because you think it's your money. So part of the challenge, it's a dance, right? In terms of how you manage, giving opportunity, giving innovation, but also being wise and careful about how you're spending your money.
Nice. And then the second pillar is leadership.
Yeah, and so leadership in my mind is and I call it courage to lead in the book. Leadership is about doing the right things and actually having the courage to do it, right? Everybody sees the things that are wrong in a company. Everybody sees, somebody's not handling this properly, or sees that, hey, there's an opportunity to build this new business or to start that new product. But it takes courage to actually choose to put your neck on the line and say, okay, let's go do it. And that's the defining factor. Bill Gates, when he started Microsoft, put his neck on the line and said, I'm going to build this. And that was the defining attribute of him being successful. So leadership is having a vision for where you need to go. But more importantly, the courage then to go there and to encourage and stir up those around you to go after it. The leadership chapter was probably the hardest chapter in the whole book, because there's only like 8,000 books on leadership.
Right.
And so, so why I went into this is like, what do I have to say about this? And the answer is, it's the same thing for every chapter. I'm not an expert on any of this, but I just wanted to help that 2-year person, that 5-year person, that 10-year person, that 20-year person understand attributes of a professional that will make them successful in 99% of the organizations out there. I'm not talking about Google or Goldman Sachs. I'm talking about most businesses out there. So leadership is visioning, it's communicating, it's encouraging, it's being faithful, it's persevering. That's leadership. And so when you go in an organization, there are always things to fix. There are always things to build. There are always things that need to be corrected, and you need to be willing to do it. And if you don't be a CFO, right?
Right. And you spent decades in startups, turnarounds, and transformations. And the third pillar is transformation.
And if you couldn't pick that up, leadership and transformation bleed into each other a lot, because the reason you don't lead to do what you did yesterday. You don't lead to just get stuff done that's always been done. You lead to transform. So the exciting part about a career, the exciting part about being a CFO, being a professional, is you get to transform things. You get to innovate. You get to create. The advantage of being a CFO in that part of the equation is you're at the top of the food chain, more or less, right? So you have the ability to influence for good innovation, creation, transformation. So frequently, I was always technology department's favorite guy, because they would come to me, and instead of saying no, I would say, okay, what do you want to do? How do you want to build it? How do we want it? What's the value that's going to be created? Okay, I'll support you. Let's go on the board. Let's tell them that's what we need to do. So I hope that most people and most organizations I worked in, if I wasn't driving the change, they found an agent of change and transformation that was supportive. I didn't support everything, because that gets back to stewardship, right?
Yeah.
But if you have a good idea, if you have a good transformational opportunity, I'm going to support you, because I don't want to do things like we did yesterday. I'm a terrible manager, but I'm a much better leader and transformer. I build teams that will, once we build things, they manage them and monitor them.
That's good stuff. And Chris, I often talk about and write about the fact that we're living in a world where most people are surviving, but not thriving, right? I mean, you're just trying to get to thrive in one piece. But you talk about, the great CEOs focus on the story behind the numbers. CFOs are just like everybody else. They are surviving, not thriving. How do you talk to a CFO and when they say, Chris, yeah, I'd love to look at the story behind numbers, but I'm just trying to make it to Friday. Like, what do you say to that CFO? Some words that can help them look past just getting the job done and becoming that high impact CEO that we've been trying to play out here.
There's a cost, right, to making and having a significant impact. And being a CFO, I mean, one of the challenges of being a CFO is no one will ever understand you, right? I couldn't tell you how many times we're going to do this, we're going to build that, we're going to shut that down, we're going to do this and that. And there are maybe many, many people within the organization that are like, shooting arrows at me, but they don't have the facts. They don't see all the pieces or even the angst in the process that went through it. But I think the the key to focusing on transformational activities comes back to the leadership and even the stewardship components, is that our job is not just to tick the boxes and dot the I's and cross the T's. It's important we're technically strong, but at the end of the day, the role of the CFO is to help the organization thrive and be successful. And that rarely means doing what's been done before, right? So when you work through a period of time when it's really hard and you're putting in those extra hours, then back to stewardship, right? You don't kill yourself. You work really hard. You envision with the team. You set the future. You tell them there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and you keep your promises that you're going to get where you need to get. And that's essential to leadership, right? Is you create a vision, you're willing to put forth to get to the vision, and you communicate honestly until you achieve the vision. But you have to take care of people through the process. But my experience over 40 years, most people love the vision. Most people want to get better. Most people don't just want to do the same job they did for the last 3 years or 5 years. So I've never found it hard to motivate and stimulate a group of people to say, hey, we can do this, we could do that, we could do this. Wouldn't it be amazing if you didn't have to do this anymore? It's That's not usually the hard part. It's getting the whole organization wrapped around that vision and making sure that you're all marching in the same direction.
That's great. Often I joke that, and you might remember this, when you were a little kid, if somebody ratted you out, you called them a narc, right? And I sometimes feel like the CFO is the narc of the office. And so you talk about partnering instead of policing business units. There has to be a bit of a fine line there, right? Where you're not 100% just, hey, whatever you guys want, like you said, but also you don't want to be the one that's going to be like, hey, by the way, Steve over there in product management really screwed the pooch with this one. So like, tell me, tell us about that delicate balance?
Yeah. No, you've done this before. Yeah. So, no, you're absolutely right. So how you achieve that, quite honestly, is you have to be authentic to both pieces, right? So when I go into a meeting and you build your reputation, you build your integrity with people. I would fight many times with the salespeople because they might have a different marketing campaign for one part of the country and not another part of the country, but they wouldn't alter maybe sales goals for that part of the country. So I would say, hey, we're spending X millions of dollars for marketing for them, not for them. They have the same sales goals. What's with that? That doesn't seem very fair to me. So so keeping things in front of you and being open and honest with them and letting them know that you care about every different aspect, that builds credibility. So when they do come to you and say, hey, Chris, I got this great idea. If you've said yes once or twice before, or you've listened honestly and carefully and worked through things, or maybe built a white paper and it just didn't work, they still see the investment and they see that you have a role to play. I never have a problem. I've never had a problem standing for what's right. And that's from we're spending too much money on employee benefits to we overcompensated on sales commissions to fighting for the fact that we should be paying these people more money. So it's you got to just make sure that you are consistent and faithful to be a faithful steward again to the company, to the people, to the leadership. And that's not always easy, right? A lot of organizations, you don't get rewarded for being a faithful steward, right? You get rewarded for saying yes to the right person. And that didn't always work out well for me in those organizations. And that's okay. That was okay.
Yeah, speaking of your past, in the book, you tell a story about struggling early in your career until you learned the value of hard work. Looking back, what was the biggest lesson from that period? Tell us where you were and tell us why it was so important to mention this. Again, you dropped it earlier. You've been doing this for a long time. Why does why did that story stick out and why you felt the need to include it in the book?
I'm a teacher at heart and I love watching people, right? And where they're at and how they're growing. I watch them myself, how I'm growing or how I'm not growing as the case might be. And yeah, a lot of my lessons, probably if you read a book, a lot of them seem to come from probably the first 10 years of my life. And that probably makes sense, right? Because you're learning a lot in the
Yeah.
first 10 years of your life. And so, college was pretty easy for me and I didn't have to work that hard. And I always had jobs. It wasn't that I wasn't busy and I didn't appreciate work, but when I got into Arthur Anderson and I was working with people that were brighter than me, and I wasn't putting in the hours that they were, suddenly I was underperforming. I was a middle of the pack guy. I'd never been a middle of the pack guy in my life. And I'm like, what the heck is going on? But at the end of the day, I hadn't learned that I just need to put in those extra hours. And I tell the story in Bermuda, I blew my knee out. I was going to the beach running, right, instead of working extra hours. And, I blew my knee out, and one of the partners in the office started taking me to the office at 7 in the morning till 7 at night. So I started working his hours, and suddenly this mediocre performer became an outperformer. And it was all from working more hours. And in my heart, I knew I wasn't working hard enough. So it was like I needed I needed that push providentially to get me to a point where this is going to be a defining aspect of my life. So I kind of set as a way to, again, steward my life because I watch a lot of workaholics. They're not necessarily great performers,
Yeah.
but there is a cost if you want to be a CFO. You can't do it on 40 hours a week. So I kind of carved out more or less a 50-hour week for me my whole life because I always had a lot of other responsibilities and obligations outside of work, my family, church, and other things included. But you have to put the hours in to have credibility with your team, to have credibility within the organization, as well as quite honestly, just to get things done. So yeah, it was it was an important lesson that no matter how smart you are or how good your ideas are, sometimes it's pure horsepower that gets you to the finish line in terms of being excellent at what you do.
Hmm.
And it made a big difference. And it wasn't, hey, I didn't work 50 hours my whole life. There were some weeks I worked 7 days, right? But consistently, a 50-hour week seemed to me to be because most people after 50-hour weeks, they start losing a lot. I used to watch people, especially in public accounting, after 50-hour weeks, they started losing a lot of productivity. So, yeah.
That makes
So,
sense. I mean, we're humans, and it's funny because that leads me into the part of the book when you talk about the narrative of mediocrity, and in that hiccup in your career, you had that wake up call of having to go in at 7, work to 7 because you're like, oh shoot, this was what I was missing. How if without people, getting injured on the beach in Bermuda, how can they identify or recognize when they're trapped in that cycle of mediocrity? Because who knows, Chris, if you didn't have that little accident on the beach, maybe you're not writing this book 30 years later. So tell me about, in terms of like now, what could people do to identify when they're caught in that narrative of mediocrity?
yeah. I think the phrase that kind of how I define who is mediocre or not, right, is by the concept of ownership, right? So what I watch for in everybody I hire and everybody I've hired for a long time is do they own their job? Not do they do their job? Do they show up for their job? Are they getting paid for their job? Do they own their job? And that makes all the difference. People who own their job aren't mediocre. Because I also talk in the book about the fact that everything you do becomes a product. It becomes a product of who you are. So if you work hard, that's who Chris is. If you're innovative, that's who Chris is. If you support people who aren't being treated properly, that's who Chris is, right? You're building this product of who you are. If I write a memo, it has a proper title, it has proper diction, it has a coherent structure. That's who Chris is. That's my product. And so when you own something, you can't own something and be mediocre. If you're a center of a football team, your job isn't just to flip the ball back to the quarterback. You got to take out that guy, and then you got to take out a linebacker, and then you got to run 20 yards down the field in case somebody else might need another block. That's somebody who owns their job, right? And you can see almost instantaneously the people that own their job and that don't. And the people that own their job will be successful in life and at work, and the people that don't basically are working for money, and they will never be happy.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
And you talk a lot about in the book about, over the course of your career, technology, how much it's changed. I can't even imagine what accounting was like 40 years ago. I'm sure it required a lot of pen and paper and really those large, comically large calculators. But you've adapted and thrived over the course of your career to the
Right.
point where now we're talking about artificial intelligence playing a major role in the CFO seat. Tell me about that. Like, what do you think is the future going forward? Like, is the CFO one of those jobs where, the AI could replace the CFO because all you'll need is you'll need some sort of LLM that will be able to point and shoot what exactly needs to be done and said yes or no to. Tell me about the relationship between AI and the CFO.
Hey, you're right. I started my career when Arthur Anderson got their first personal computers, right? So I lived my entire career threshold is really the life of the computer, and it's changed fundamentally and completely. And I've embraced it through the whole journey, right? And
Really?
so in when the internet first comes out and what's that going to do and how's that going to be used and all those kinds of things. And for the most part, it has proved to be very useful and very successful. AI is powerful, right? And no, am I concerned that CFOs are going to lose their jobs because of AI? No, not at all. Because if CFOs lose their job, AI has replaced everybody known to man because the CFO job requires all kinds of complexity and leadership and aspects that many of which we've already had a conversation around. The
So, like
AI,
Terminator, CFO is only losing their job on Judgment Day. Before
exactly.
that, they will be gainfully employed, but until Judgment Day comes around, you'll be okay.
So I'm watching AI, the commentaries AI will replace the repetitive tasks and things like that. And I think that's true. I think it's going to do a lot more when it comes to what your car is capable of doing or what your electric broom at home will be able to do and things like that. I think that, and I have to, you're probably going to edit this now, but AI is why what I watch, like, so we go back to stewardship, right? Stewardship transformation. What is AI doing to the people? That's part of what I'm watching, right? I mean, MIT did a study on, they had control groups, and one they gave a team go use AI immediately. The other one do some work for a little while, another one don't use it until the very end or at all. And within a short period of time, the first group wasn't even thinking. They just took the question, threw it into AI, said, this is the answer, and popped it back out. That is not healthy, right? And so AI is I think is going to have a massive impact on many, many things. But at the end of the day, people need to be able to understand and translate and interpret what is coming out of AI. And so, I think that some of the things I talk about, especially in knowledge and communication in my chapters and the foundational chapters, is people that are classically educated in terms of communication and writing and speaking and those kinds of things. Basically, classical education used to teach people how to think, right? That's going to come back into vogue. If you are highly technical, you might lose some bandwidth because of AI. But for people that can write and speak and interpret and communicate and lead and envision from the results that come out of AI, those people will continue to be essential in that economy.
Awesome. And lastly, there is this trend in fractional CFOs. And I wonder how the idea of being a high impact CEO when you're fractionally there, for lack of a better word, tell me
Yeah.
about how these sort of like laws and sort of pillars that you've set forth. How does that work in that sphere of the fractional CFO?
Yeah. Well, I'm serving as a fractional CFO as we speak in a non for profit. I work 3 hours a week there. I like the concept of fractional CFOs, and I think that it enhances what we're talking about, or maybe optimizes the use of those kinds of people. because frequently in smaller organizations, you would have maybe somebody that was more technically oriented, that was getting the financials done and getting the taxes done, but wasn't going to that next level of looking strategically and building teams and challenging the C-suite to take on new opportunities and take new risks because you don't have the money. I mean, part of there's a cost to having a high impact CFO, and it's called a salary and benefits, and not everybody has those skills, and not everybody has that background, and so I think that fractional CFOs, I think it's a good thing, especially for smaller businesses, that you can bring somebody in that has that experience and those background and those skills, and you can begin to leverage those for a fraction of the cost and help move the organization forward. So maybe then you can afford and need a full-time, high impact CFO at that point in time. So all in, I like it. I think that there's challenges with it. It's as soon as you are fractional, it means you're doing something else, which means you're distracted. So I think the challenges on the fractional side then is, are you focused? Are you able to, if I need you on Thursday to make a decision, are you going to be there or not? So I think there's some practical challenges because you're moving closer to a consulting kind of relationship than being somebody that's there all the time. But I think there's a place in a lot of organizations for a fractional CFO. I think it could be a really good thing.
Excellent. Well, you can read all about it in his book, The CFO Advantage, Elevate Your Role from Financial Technician to Visionary Business Leader. He is Chris Festog. Chris, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it, Joe.
And that's going to do it for this episode. If you want to find out more information about Chris and our other amazing authors, go to theauthoritycompany.com.